Well, welcome to this webinar that's jointly sponsored by Sallux, the European Christian Political Movement, and the Jubilee Centre in the UK. We're both dedicated to applying Christian thinking in the Bible to issues of public policy. And it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Ferguson, who is a solicitor in Edinburgh in Scotland. He had a missionary family background and he grew up in Japan. Did his law degree at Glasgow University. He has worked and written for the Jubilee Centre in the past, and we're very pleased that he agreed to write an article for us, reflecting on the recent coming into law of the Scottish Hate Crime Act that had originally been passed in 2021, but was sort of brought into force more recently. He's going to speak for around 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. If you have a question that crops up as he speaks, please put it in the chat, and then we'll reflect on that when he's finished. It's worth mentioning that the topic of hate speech is becoming an extraordinarily topical one around the world, with recent disputes and fights in the US, Brazil, in particular, Australia, and the UK. And so it's particularly apt that we try and think deeply about this question from a Christian perspective. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew now. And as I said, if you've got questions as he speaks, please put them in the chat. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Ruben, if I can ask you to go on to the first slide there, please. Picking up from what Paul said at the start, on the 18th of January this year, the European Parliament voted by a large majority to call for hate speech to be made a crime across the European Union. Being convinced that hate is on the rise across Europe and that certain member states are not doing enough to combat it, MEPs put pressure on the Council of Europe, the European Council, excuse me, to make hate speech based on race, religion, and sexuality and more a criminal offence in each EU member state. While such changes to EU law normally require unanimous consent from all member states, MEPs have pledged and put pressure to get round this and impose the laws on non-consenting states using mechanisms called passerelle clauses. The Parliament's press release said, as you can see on the screen here, freedom of expression should not be used as a shield for hate speech. Once again, hate speech is at the forefront of Western politics, and the EU is not the only one. Just as Paul was saying, 5 months ago, the Scottish Parliament, which is where I'm from, introduced a controversial new hate speech law. In England, summer riots saw the courts come down heavily on those inciting violence and hatred, so-called, including a 15-month prison sentence for a 53-year-old woman over a 9-word Facebook post. Meanwhile, governments including France and Brazil clash with social media bosses over illicit content on platforms, including hate speech. So what are we to make of all of this? And how should Christians respond? The aim of the presentation today is to encourage Christians to think deeply and critically about the issue of hate speech. To begin, we will explore what the Bible has to say about the place of speech in society. And with these principles in mind, we will then examine how the legal concepts of free speech and hate speech are understood across Europe before explaining the challenges and threats that hate speech and its underlying ideology pose to our societies. Next slide, please, Ruben. So the concept of freedom of speech from a classical liberal tradition will be familiar, coming from some of Europe's finest thinkers from the 1600s onwards. These include Erasmus, John Stuart Mill, Rosa Luxemburg, and George Orwell, both of those pictured here. The spirit of freedom of speech from this tradition is captured well in this defiant quote from Orwell. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. The essence is that a free society should defend the expression of all opinions, even and especially those unpopular and offensive. Next slide, please, Ruben. However, as Christians, it's imperative that our thinking is grounded not in the classical liberal tradition, but in Scripture. The Bible contains a profound fund of thought regarding the place of speech in society. In fact, much of it aligns with classical liberalism, but this is little surprising. As the British historian Tom Holland argues in his book Dominion, secular norms on free speech today emerged out of a Christian and a particularly Protestant worldview. The Bible itself, however, contains no explicit teaching on free speech. But what the Bible does have in abundance are laws and wisdom concerning the place of speech within communities. The biblical tradition exalts the sacred role of speech. Of all the powers available to God, it was through the spoken word that he fashioned the universe, and it was through the word became flesh that he rescued us from our helplessness. This is not merely a symbolic truth. Our capacity to listen and to speak distinguishes us from the rest of God's creation and is an integral part of our formation in the divine image. It's no coincidence at all that speech is the medium chosen by God to communicate with us through prayer and through his written word. But the Bible does also equip us with rules and principles on how speech should be governed in society. Old Testament law does contain some speech restrictions, specifically blasphemy, false prophecy, false testimony, the cursing of parents and of leaders. There are 3 points to note with these. Firstly, these prohibitions existed in the context of Old Testament Israel as a theocratic constitutional polity. Although they are instructive as a vision for God's ordering of human societies, they are not intended as a blueprint for secular governments today. Secondly, those restrictions that did exist were narrowly defined and understood. Take the most famous example of blasphemy. As biblical law professor Jonathan Burnside explains, in Old Testament Israel, blaspheming was a high charge involving the cursing or degrading of God's name, in effect, a character assassination. Thirdly, what is notable about these speech restrictions is actually how few they were. Although there are historical questions around how speech was actually policed in ancient Israel, in legal terms, any bans were few and properly defined. You'll especially see this once we get into speech restrictions today by comparison. Next slide, please, Ruben. An essential principle that runs throughout the biblical canon is the importance of truthful speech across all relationships. The Bible is full of exhortations and fearless examples of proclaiming truth even in the face of mobs and tyrants. Throughout biblical history, believers are commanded to put away falsehood and speak the truth. When the apostles Peter and John were hauled before the Jewish authorities and charged not to speak of Jesus, they answered, as you see on the screen, "Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard." Is the Bible's command to speak the truth somehow limited or conditional? Not so. Believers are never to compromise on truth, even in the face of the law. From Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's defiance of Nebuchadnezzar to the imprisonment of the apostles, Christians are not to surrender their profession of truth. The Bible readily acknowledges that truth can cause and often causes division and, importantly, offense. Jesus' parables and teachings routinely disturbed listeners. In fact, the Bible even endorses pointed criticism and mockery where merited. On Mount Carmel, the prophet Elijah taunted the followers of Baal, even insinuating that he was busy relieving himself, according to some translations. But that is what the Bible says can be the limit of even pointed speech. But now, this is not to say that Christians should be crude or tactless in their speech, far from it. Unlike the classical liberal tradition, the Bible cautions Christians to speak purely and uprightly, not vulgarly. Christian freedom of speech is counterbalanced by responsibility to think and speak righteously. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. In particular, the books of Proverbs and James warn against the destructive power of a foolish tongue. That being said, the Bible does not state that the control of speech should be a matter of law. Rather, it is a matter of self-governance, subject to oversight of families, communities, and the church. The fool depicted in Proverbs is not reprimanded by authorities, but rather ensnared by his own folly. Yet there is no suggestion in the Bible that the control of people's speech in this way is the concern of legal justice. Moreover, the desire to control speech, especially opinions and beliefs, is so often an act of hubris and even playing God, denying our fallen human nature. To claim that we know the truth so absolutely that we can forbid any challenge to it is a profound arrogance and blindness to our own fallibility. Allowing free speech and open inquiry, therefore, is a humble recognition of our lack of knowledge before God. Next slide, please, Ruben. So to bring this full circle, what principles can we deduce from the Bible concerning freedom of speech today? Firstly, that the capacity to listen and speak is a wonderful, precious thing to be preserved. By allowing people to speak their thoughts, we affirm their human dignity and creation in the image of a God who himself speaks. Secondly, that people ought to be able to express truth and conscience, even where this causes offense. Thirdly, that God holds us responsible to speak honestly and graciously, avoiding slander and foul talk. And fourthly and finally, that the control of speech chiefly belongs not with governments, but with individuals and local communities. With these principles in mind, it's now time to consider the challenge that hate speech poses to a Christian view of speech. Next slide, please, Ruben. To understand the operation of hate speech laws, it's first necessary to know how free speech protections work in Europe. Across the world, freedom of speech is routinely afforded legal protection in constitutions. The most famous of these is the First Amendment to the US Constitution, shown here. It's worth quoting in full as it best encapsulates the classical liberal tradition. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What immediately sticks out in the First Amendment is that it allows no exceptions. Congress shall make no law. This is a maximalist notion of free speech, stating explicitly that regulation of speech is not the proper concern of government. Although the US Supreme Court has since devised boundaries to speech in cases like fraud and slander, freedom of speech still enjoys robust protection in America today. That being said, the famous speech around free speech that you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre, that does come from the US Supreme Court. Modern European constitutions, on the other hand, are more influenced by a different tradition, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the French Revolutionary Charter, again, as you see here. The free communication of thoughts and of opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. Any citizen thus may speak, write, print freely, save to respond to the abuse of this liberty in the cases determined by the law. Now, the second half here is the key. Free speech is a qualified right. This limited view of freedom of speech has been more influential in shaping European constitutions, where the right is restricted by other priorities. Next slide, please, Ruben. The German constitution shown here is a typical example. Note the part in bold, the provision of general laws. Now, under this qualifier, German law, the basic law, restricts a broad range of speech. Some examples: insulting people in public, downplaying the Holocaust, supporting banned political parties, insulting other religions, and of course, hate speech. Until 2018, it was even an offence to insult foreign heads of state. This was only repealed following an international outcry over a police investigation of a German comedian named Jan Böhmermann for a poem that he wrote, a satirical poem about Turkey's President Erdogan, both people pictured here. This demonstrates that freedom of speech can be limited quite broadly in Europe in a way that would be impossible in America. Beyond national constitutions, the most important free speech protections in Europe come from the European Convention on Human Rights. In the case of Britain, the only one, because Britain doesn't have a written constitution in the way other European countries do. Article 11 of the Convention states that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. However, governments may limit this freedom by a host of exceptions, including what is necessary in a democratic society, public safety, protection of health, protection of morals, and so on. These cover a multitude of possibilities. Moreover, and importantly, they grant judges, as opposed to elected representatives, the power to decide what is and isn't, say, necessary in a democracy. And we'll get back to this in a bit. These limitations are significant as we approach the question of hate speech. Next slide, please, Ruben. As mentioned, hate speech is not the only category of speech limitation. There are what we might call essential restrictions, without which a society couldn't possibly function. Instigation of crime, defamation, fraud, harassment. There is not a country in the world that allows these, and they're not controversial. But the justification for speech restrictions beyond these few gets a bit murkier. In the European context, some of these murkier examples include glorifying terrorism, downplaying historical atrocities like communism, communist gulags, or the Holocaust, denigrating the nation, blasphemy, and lèse-majesty, which is the insulting of monarchs. Hate speech is a more recent addition to this list. So what is meant by the term hate speech? It varies by country, but an encompassing definition might be as follows: speech which demeans or invites hostility against others based on characteristics including race, religion, sexuality, and the like. This is broadly the position across much of Europe. Just as a sample, here are the definitions from the Swedish and Dutch penal codes, which I'll let you read at your leisure. The definitions here broadly align. To the perceptive, however, one small but important difference is that in the Netherlands, hate speech is only a public offence, whereas in Sweden, one can be charged for what is said in private. On the face of it, it can be challenging to argue against hate speech laws because they seem to possess a self-evident moral high ground. Surely hatred is a terrible thing. Who wants to see minorities abused simply for who they are? Indeed, it's this self-professed kindness and compassion which makes hate speech laws so tricky to challenge. Who wants to be on the side of hatred? I don't. But a fundamental flaw of hate speech laws is the uncertainty around what hate means and who gets to define it. Any decent lawyer will tell you that an indispensable quality of a law is its precision, clarity, lack of ambiguity. Does hate speech meet this standard? At face value, its meaning may seem obvious. It covers vulgar racist abuse, calls for genocide, and the like. But the word hatred, or the equivalent in any European language, is far too vague to be confined to these extremes. As I'm sure you've all encountered, the epithet hate has been ascribed to all manner of viewpoints: supporting the exclusivity of traditional marriage, upholding the rights of the unborn in the womb, observing the biological reality of gender, and on and on. And here lies the crux. Hatred in its ordinary sense describes an emotion: antipathy, disgust, repugnance. However, the word has now taken on a parallel meaning. In modern parlance, hatred has become less about the emotion and more about opinion or worldview. Being hateful today is to hold opinions or values contrary to the day's prevailing and quickly changing norms. This is what explains the contradictions that we will see, where the so-called advocates, often for love and inclusivity, so often seem to display a real hatred against those they disagree with. It's because the language has been altered. Next slide, please, Ruben. An English court case from 2019 demonstrates this point. A lady called Maya Forstater was working for a think tank in St Albans in England. At the time, the Conservative government was considering reforms to gender transition laws to allow people to self-declare their new gender. Miss Forstater, a feminist, expressed concerns about these plans, saying, and I quote, "Sex is immutable and not to be conflated with gender identity." Based on these comments, her employer refused to renew her contract and she lost her job. Ms. Forstater sued the think tank. However, the judge ruled against her, claiming that her gender-critical beliefs were, and I quote, "not worthy of respect in a democratic society." This was astounding. The belief that sex and gender are biologically determined is widely shared, and you might even say common sense. However, the judge claimed that this was an unacceptable view to hold, beyond the pale. Fortunately, Ms. Forstater's case was reversed on appeal, but it was a close shave and shows how this transformation in the meaning of hatred as the wrong opinion can even seep into our justice system. Next slide, please, Ruben. So often, the collateral damage of hate speech laws is expression of truth and legitimate opinion. This is a fundamental Christian concern, particularly when it comes to discussion of biblical sexual ethics or criticism of other religions. Given their imprecision, hate speech laws can suffer from a baby in the bathwater, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater effect. They may well prevent genuine abuses and prejudice, but they also ensnare legitimate viewpoints, thereby discouraging free inquiry. As an example, in 2018, the Austrian criminal court convicted Elisabeth Sabadic-Wolf for insinuating that the historical Muhammad engaged in paedophilia. Mrs. Sabadic-Wolf appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, claiming infringement of free speech. However, the European Court unanimously refused, citing the need to promote, and I quote, religious peace. Bizarrely, what the court found wrongful in Mrs. Sabadic-Wolf's statements, as you can see on the screen, was not the factual content of her speech, but her implication that, I quote, Muhammad was not a worthy subject of worship. In effect, this is a European court upholding Islamic blasphemy law. What makes this more troubling was that Mrs. Sabadic-Wolf's observations were not made up, but based on actual Muslim texts, which do claim that Muhammad took a child as his wife. This is a staggering judgment from the European Court, and it would be hard to imagine Christian teachings being granted the same protection. Other prosecutions in Europe have focused on issues of legitimate opinion, most often relating to immigration and multiculturalism and other moral issues. One such case, as you can see the picture here, involved comments by a prominent Christian politician from Finland called Päivi Räsänen. Apologies if I'm butchering that name. In 2019, Mrs. Räsänen publicly criticized the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland for their participation in LGBT pride events. For this criticism, a Finnish prosecutor filed several charges against her, each carrying a potential 2-year prison sentence. Fortunately, again, Mrs. Räsänen was acquitted, although the prosecutor did continue to appeal. However, this is a warning sign. As mentioned before, there's no guarantee that courts will always hold to a liberal line on free speech, particularly as social values keep changing. Furthermore, the mere threat of legal action is often enough to have a chilling effect on freedom of speech, even if the litigants are acquitted. Who would take the risk, expense, and exhaustion of a criminal or civil trial? Better just to stay quiet. Next slide, please, Ruben. Hate speech poses several problems beyond this, and we can't go into detail into all these today for the question of time. But briefly, there's the issue of evidence. How can we prove that comments were actually motivated by hatred? How do you get into the head of the litigant? A related issue is that hate speech is so often a victimless crime. In the case of Mrs. Sabadic-Wolf just mentioned there, the prosecution couldn't actually identify anyone who was offended. They pointed instead to a vague and ill-defined concept of disturbance of religious peace. Perhaps most concerning are the countries like Sweden and my home country, Scotland, which punish speech made in the privacy of the home. Not only is this an unwelcome invitation for state surveillance, worse is the potential relational strain caused within families. Could we see situations where children are asked by their teachers or social workers to report on any hateful comments made by their parents? I hope not, but here we are. Beyond these practical issues, though, it's useful to consider the ideological values that underline hate speech laws. Excuse me. Ostensibly, hate speech laws are motivated by kindness and a desire to protect society's most vulnerable. No doubt, many politicians who push these laws do believe this. However, we must dig deeper. What is really happening here? The Scottish hate crime law that I mentioned gives us some clues. As in much of Europe, this law criminalizes hate speech based on race, religion, gender identity, and the like. But this law also did something interesting. An obscure provision at the end of the Act abolished the ancient offence of blasphemy. Now, this abolition was entirely symbolic. Scotland hasn't had a blasphemy trial since 1842. Why abolish it? But what makes this so instructively ironic is that in abolishing one form of blasphemy, the law simply reinstated it with another form, the replacement of an inviolable God with irreproachable expressions of human identity. As religiosity has declined in the West, so our moral landscape has undergone a radical transformation, particularly in how we conceive human identity. Christianity teaches that human beings are both created with dignity in the image of God, but also corrupted by sin and in need of salvation. In a godless worldview, however, our previous need for God is diverted inward. Casting off ideas like original sin, Westerners increasingly find goodness and value in their inherent nature as human beings. Such thinking derives from a combination of Rousseau, who believed that human beings are born innocent and uncorrupted, and postmodernist theories, which place greater value in individual human experience over objective truth. Hence, you keep hearing the phrases, my truth, or lived experience. The result is this, what we call the psychologization of the self. This means an understanding of individual freedom as freedom to live out a psychological identity. In order for the individual to be truly free, his environment must be one that affirms and celebrates his self-expression. Now, this transformation explains a great deal of what we have discussed with hate speech. In this worldview, aspects of our humanity, particularly those with which we are born, are pure and inviolable. But it doesn't end there. Even behaviors and expressions connected with those aspects of our humanity also become untouchable. For example, a Christian disagreeing with somebody's sexual activities becomes not just a rebuke of their behavior, but an affront to their very identity. There is no room in this thinking for separating sin and sinner. Other instances include suppressing criticism of religions like Islam by conflating criticism of doctrine with racial prejudice, justified by deliberately vague phrases like Islamophobia. Of course, Muslims are not one race and come from all sorts of nationalities, just like Christians. But this thinking can now even extend to symbols. 2 years ago, a man in Hampshire, England, was detained by police for posting a rainbow pride flag in the shape of a swastika. A bit extreme, perhaps, but all of this is a far cry from simply stopping genuine abuse. Rather, legitimate moral and political opinions are being thwarted. Next slide, please, Ruben. So to wrap this all up, how might Christians respond to the dangers posed by hate speech laws? It goes without saying, it calls for much wisdom and discernment. Many Christians will disagree rightly on this, and there will not be a single uniform view, but here are some principles that we might find common ground on. It is an abiding wish for Christians to live at peace with earthly authorities. It goes without saying. The New Testament is clear that Christians are to pray for and obey their governments, which are installed by God himself. It does remain a privilege today that in Europe, by and large, we live in countries where we can freely congregate to worship God. But for Christians, it is critical that the law protects our ability to speak truth and proclaim the gospel. We must therefore advocate against laws which discourage or criminalize this. We have seen how loose language like hate speech or worthiness in a democracy can be employed to censor legitimate and mainstream opinions. It is important for Christians, particularly as people of the word, to plead against such ambiguous language in law, given its susceptibility to manipulation and censorship. The concept of hate speech inherently veers towards suppressing unpopular or minority viewpoints, as discussed. Of course, Christians do not want to see genuine abuse and prejudice go unpunished. Christians hate racism. Christians hate all forms of bias and indignity. But these crimes are mostly already covered by other offences like incitement to violence or harassment. Therefore, Christians may consider campaigning for the abolition of hate speech laws, particularly in the case of those vaguely worded. However, should other Christians take the view that some concept of hate speech is necessary to protect minorities from abuse, then we should ensure that these laws are counterbalanced by robust free speech protections. In fact, this was the case in the law introduced in Scotland this year. Opposition members of Parliament passed amendments to ensure that, and I quote, ideas that offend, shock, or disturb would not on their own constitute hate speech. If hate speech laws are to exist, such clear statements are essential in preventing a mission creep towards censorship. Above all, at times of great moral shifts like today, it's vital for Christians to ground themselves in the Bible, equipping themselves with a sound understanding of God's vision for society. With wisdom and with discernment, we will be able to illuminate the errors and dangers of the world's ways, even those well-intended, and show a different path towards freedom in Christ. Next slide, please, Ruben, and that's me finished, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Matthew. That's extremely informative and a nice range of examples from across Europe. We don't have any questions apart from, is the presentation going to be posted in the Q&A?
So.
Yes, it's being recorded, and we can certainly post the PowerPoint. So before while we wait for other questions to come in, I better try and venture something. I mean, we sort of made a link between blasphemy laws going out, sort of Judeo-Christian blasphemy laws going out at the same time as new blasphemy laws coming in. Do you get the sense that this is a characteristic of the secularization of society, that effectively societies tend to need a blasphemy law, and they then shape what they're trying to protect most, what they worship the most, with a blasphemy law?
Yes, I think there definitely is a link there. As they say, society hates a vacuum, hates a moral vacuum. And where you get rid of God, you don't simply just displace that feeling towards worship, you direct it to somewhere else. I think, as discussed, it's a particularly dangerous thing when that is directed towards our sense of humanity. I mean, much as we might find it absurd, at least in societies that directed it towards a false god or something, at least there wasn't this pretense that, as it were, human beings were worthy of the same protections. This is true across many spectrums. So this is not just humanity, but even in politics. We know of the two major totalitarian politics of the 20th century, fascism and communism. They each, whether it be the nation or the party, they each had to have some conduit, if you want to call that worship or veneration. But effectively, it's the same thing. And in fact, finding out what that thing is, I mean, there's a quote that goes, I don't know the origin of the quote. If you want to know who rules over you, figure out who you're not allowed to criticize. I think the quote does have a bit of a dodgy origin, but it's a good point, and it's a good litmus test. Hate speech laws, what we are not allowed to criticize, is a good place to find out what a society truly values. And I think the advantage of blasphemy laws do get a bad name. And I understand that I wouldn't want to reintroduce blasphemy laws. But one advantage they do have is that they sap away from other things they need to protect. So by saying that protection belongs to God and his honor alone, it means that we allow free discussion for everything else, and everything else is fair game. Perhaps in a similar way that sometimes people will defend constitutional monarchy because it takes the veneration away from, as it were, politicians who actually wield power. I think the blasphemy laws can have a similar effect. But yes, to answer your question, I think it's very much connected, and I think the battle for free speech is a permanent one for that reason.
It's worth drawing the example of Thailand into perspective, where the king or the monarchy is venerated sort of religiously, and therefore any insult to the king or the monarch is certainly imprisonment for a long time. We've got some questions coming in, first from Jonathan Hornberg, although he sort of withdrew it, but we can just clarify. Is Brexit going to shield the UK from the sort of hate speech narratives that are coming to EU states, or in a sense are we in the same boat because we have politicians, as in the Scottish bill, who think in the same way?
Legally, the answer is yes. Britain's no longer bound by incoming EU laws. But as I said, Britain has plenty of their own laws in England and Wales. If we're to get into the legislation, England and Wales has the Public Order Act of 1986, which contains a host of prohibitions against stirring up hatred. And then in Scotland, as I said, we have the hate crime law from 2021 brought in this year as well. And by and large, they are broadly comparable to what we see in Europe. And as I said, Britain, although we've left the European Union, we are still part of the European Convention on Human Rights. So that will carry on in terms of, that's obviously a free speech redress. But as I said, that the European Court of Human Rights has been less than desirably protective of freedom of speech in the past, I would say. So no, Britain will be, as it were, protected from these European laws, but I don't see that making any material difference.
Then had a question from Rod, who says, is there a link between new hate speech laws and debates over no platforming in campuses?
Yes, I think that was no platforming. That was primarily sort of in the last 10 years that sort of started to come up. I might be wrong on that. I think there's an interesting distinction to make. So often what people who are in favor of no platforming will say is, I'm not against your freedom of speech, but freedom of speech doesn't mean a right to a platform. So there's a sort of, I think it's a form of casuistry, but there's this idea that just because you can, as it were, you can howl at the moon, but that doesn't mean we need to give you a place, particularly on this university campus. I think that's, at some point that makes sense. So what they'll often say is freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. And I understand that just because I have a right to free speech doesn't mean I get to go onto the BBC and say what I want. But at the same time, a freedom of speech that removes the right of listeners to hear is no freedom at all. Freedom of speech has to allow some sort of freedom of platform. Otherwise, it's a husk of a right. It has no bite. So how those lines are drawn, I'm not sure. But particularly in a university campus. So it was quite, in Britain recently, the outgoing Conservative government brought in a bill to ensure freedom of speech in universities. And one of the first acts of the current Labour government has been to not proceed with that bill. And I just think that if you can't have free speech in universities, where can you have it? So I think universities must hold the standard, because otherwise the rest of society certainly won't. So I think the two things are connected, but not in legal terms, but they are connected.
Next question from Paul. Do you agree that Holocaust denial should be prohibited by law?
Ask an easy question.
I think certain European countries do take this
yes,
very seriously.
My view is that it shouldn't be a criminal offence. I should start by saying I understand why it is. I understand why it is in Germany, in Austria and France, I think in the Netherlands, particularly in these countries that either participated in or were victim to the Holocaust. I understand why in a post-war context especially. But I think it's important to think about this from base principles. So I think what Holocaust denial laws do is they come up with an official narrative of history. So it's not just Holocaust denial laws. It should be the laws against it are denying the Holocaust, approving the Holocaust, or downplaying the Holocaust. And now downplaying the Holocaust is the one that I want to maybe touch on. Freedom of speech is inseparable from freedom of inquiry. You must be free to reach an opinion in good faith that you believe the evidence leads to. Say if I am a historian and I am researching in good faith, and I take the view, rightly or wrongly, that, you know what, I don't think the numbers add up. I don't think it was 6 million. I think it was more likely 2 or 3. Should that be a criminal offence? Well, I don't know. That's the question. But what you're doing there is you're putting essentially a pair of handcuffs on history, on inquiry, and you're saying that this is the official narrative. Now, this, I think, is a problem for several reasons, and I'll get into this. The most important of these is, let me begin again. I think that the problem with this is, I think we can go back to the most influential speaker and writer on free speech is John Stuart Mill, on his paper In Liberty. And what he said in his paper In Liberty is, the sign that something is true beyond reasonable doubt is that it can take upon itself any challenge, safe in the knowledge that it will be verified, that it will come true. So actually, banning challenge against Holocaust denial isn't a sign that that the case for the Holocaust, the historical narrative, is solid beyond doubt. It actually reveals a vulnerability. But actually, in allowing a challenge to go ahead, what we do is that we keep the debate fresh. We understand why the Holocaust did happen. By being challenged, we're able then to find out, well, how do I know that the Holocaust happened? And then we go into a whole trove of evidence. The evidence is overwhelming, but without challenge, we aren't necessarily exposed to it in the same degree. And as John Stuart Mill wrote, what happens then is you get a stagnant truth. People believe in the Holocaust. People believe the Holocaust happened not because of the evidence, but because it's almost from authority, but because it's the truth. And if that is a situation, anyone worth their salt, any Holocaust denier worth their salt, who comes along and challenges that, what are you going to say? You're not well versed in the evidence. So I think it's a good way to keep truths live. But I think the more important point I want to say is the precedent that it sets. That if we ban, for instance, Holocaust denial, look at what the Polish government did. The Law and Justice government in Poland passed a law in 2018 saying it's a criminal offense to attribute any blame to Poland for any of its role in the Holocaust. Why is that a problem? Because we know from history that pogroms did take place in Poland. Most famously, the Jedwabne pogrom, and even pogroms after the Nazis left. We know the Polish names of people who, now that's not to say Poland obviously was very much the victim of the Second World War. But if you place handcuffs on history like this, what's then to stop the Turks passing a law saying you're not allowed to attribute blame to Turkey for the genocide, or the Burma government doing the same thing? If you start this, other countries will follow and dictators will follow. I think that in my home country, Holocaust denial is not a crime. And I think that allows us to see Holocaust deniers for what they are. I'll just finish with this one point. I think that even the most abhorrent views should be aired. Just with one example to finish. About 20 years ago in Britain, there was a political party known as the BNP, the British National Party. Had a leader, a man named Nick Griffin. This was a party gaining very wide popularity, and it very much was what we might call a hard right party. I don't say this in the way that it's flippantly used today. It was genuinely a racist party. What did Britain do? Well, they invited him, Nick Griffin, on to the most popular television show, BBC Question Time. And they interrogated Mr. Griffin over his views and showed him out to be the genuine monster that he was. And that caused the BNP's popularity to fall to the ground. And I think that's the same. If we suppress speech, we push it underground. I want to know what Holocaust deniers are thinking. I want to know their arguments. I want to rebut them. I don't want them jailed. I don't want them martyrs. And I don't think that suppression of it is certainly helping in Europe today. So it's a long answer, but I don't think that it should be a criminal offence.
Okay. Thank you for that. I won't comment on that because we've got 3 more questions to try and get through. So another question from Anonymous. How do you think these laws will be policed? Will humour or making fun be under scrutiny, for instance? So there's concerns, say, California has just passed a law outlawing artificial intelligence-driven political parodies. And so it's sort of, the idea is it's now illegal to meme in certain ways around elections. But I think in particular, there's concerns that, as you said, the protections of the family in the home are going to be weaponized, as it were, to suppress opinions that may be prosecuted if revealed to authorities. Do you just want to amplify on
yes,
some of those ideas?
Just to start on the humour point, I can guarantee you that the person in charge policing humour will be the most grey and boring bureaucrat, the most humorous bureaucrat imaginable. So I think once you start drawing lines on speech like this, it's a mission creep. You'll inevitably be taking chunks. I don't think it's human beings in our fallen nature are fit to address those questions. That's one of the arguments for freedom of speech, is that it's far too difficult to draw these margins. And comedic speech very often is the most subversive speech of them all. So I can even see that being, as it were, the first victims of it. It'll be interesting for me. I live in Edinburgh. Edinburgh obviously is famous for its comedy festival. So it'll be interesting to see in the years that come the degree to which these hate speech laws make an impact. Just on the policing in the home point, yes, I think it's very worrying. So in England and Wales and in other countries, it's a specific defence. Speech made within the home cannot count as hate speech. You can't be prosecuted for that, and there's good reason for that because, well, first of all, as I say, it's the home is a private place. It's a place where we can test ideas, where we can vent if we want to. Very often, I'm sure everyone said something outrageous in the home or shouted at television, but it's a place where we can be civilized, where if I do have viewpoints that are beyond the pale or extreme, family members can correct me in love, and that lets me go out into the world and be a more decent human being and not repress these bad sentiments. The most worrying thing, as you say, is given the increase in surveillance technology, and I'm not saying that governments are using these today, but we're talking about what can be the case in 30 years' time. When we're thinking of laws, we can't just think of the current context. We need to think, what would somebody with less of a respect for freedom interpret these laws to mean?
Well, just to raise a concern, I mean, anyone's mobile phone can be remotely turned on by security services, and the microphone and the camera can be turned on. So in that sense, it's not theoretical. Alexa or whatever are spying on you. Modern cars record what's being said in the car and transmit it. Yeah. So it's not a theoretical point even now.
No, I think it would be terrible to return to that. I mean, yes, I mean, I'm sure people on this call will know those who grew up in Eastern Europe during the communist years. I have family who did. No, that's a chapter we should close.
Two final questions. One from Core saying, regarding free speech, what's the link to disinformation, and who will determine what disinformation is? I think we've got to, even in the legislations, there's a distinction between what's categorized as hate, with the idea of demeaning or particular groups, versus mis or disinformation, which is dealt with in different legislative action. So in the UK, the Online Safety Act now sort of brings various penalties for the spreading of untruths. I'm not sure of the legal definition of the context, but that's the distinction from hate speech. Of course, the regulated media are exempt from these laws. It's only social media and private websites that are subject to these laws. There's a carve-out for regulated media who can spread as much disinformation as they like at the behest of the government, but they're exempt. But I don't know if Matthew wants to sort of comment on this distinction.
Yes. Obviously, it's slightly separate from the hate speech refrain, but I'm happy to give my 50p, as it were. No, it's very topical. It's very difficult. It captures so much, this idea of disinformation. I don't use the word. I just use lies or truth. But the difficulty, as always. So I mean, the idea of dishonest information potentially being a criminal offence is nothing new. Fraud. That can be what it is. For instance, if a company wants to sell you goods and services and they misrepresent, they say this is a bottle of Coca-Cola, but actually it's something poisonous. Well, that's a case of fraud. If you lie about somebody to the detriment of their reputation, that's defamation or slander or libel. So the idea that dishonesty can be linked to a free speech restriction is not controversial at all. It's the question of where you draw the line. I think we can go back to coronavirus for some interesting examples of why the quest to suppress disinformation too often leads to legitimate, truthful information being thrown out. It's the baby in the bathwater again. So to say my viewpoint on that, I think that disinformation should be allowed only because it prevents truthful speech from getting through during, whether that comes from the government or social media companies. Actually, during coronavirus, we see now from the evidence that the two were working in tandem. The government was pressuring the likes of Facebook to, the case in point being, for instance, the origin of the coronavirus. Did it have a natural origin? Did it leak from a lab? That was a very important question at the time of COVID, especially in understanding the disease and preventing it in the future. But such a level of obfuscation, censorship, in fact, censorship by social media companies who took down any suggestion that the virus might have come from a lab, that was instigated by a letter written by certain people, the ringleader of whom actually had a financial interest in the lab in question. I mean, that's just skullduggery. That's just corruption. But the main point of what I want to say there is that, especially in times of crisis, these things come along. So I was saying earlier, you can't shout fire at a crowded theatre. That's essentially the same argument. But what always happens in these cases is that you end up throwing out truthful and legitimate. Interestingly enough, the court case that gave us that saying, you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre, whenever you hear these cliches, it's interesting to think what actually happened in that case. That was a case from 1919 in America, during a time of probably the closest America's ever had to a dictator. Woodrow Wilson was the president. Americans were drafted into the military to fight in the First World War. Now, there was a Yiddish-speaking socialist, a man called Mr. Schenck, who opposed that. He said, as Americans, we are free citizens. You should have the right not to go into the war if you want to be to resist the draft. For that, he was detained. And hence comes the phrase, you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre. Actually, the words were a bit different. But what you might say is the First World War was very much a fire in a very crowded theatre indeed. Historians to this day debate, was it a righteous war to have? Was America right to participate in it? And if we're even debating this today, freedom of speech matters more in times of crisis. It matters more that unpopular opinions can come out. There's an old Latin saying, in times of war, the laws fall silent, but actually that's not true. They must speak louder than ever. So disinformation, misinformation, there's an additional challenge there. I'll just finish off with this one. Like I said, I think it should be allowed because we need truthful information to come through. But I do think social media companies, there is a risk in a sense of, especially now we live in an environment where I think it's called psyops, informational warfare is a thing, where, for instance, Russian instigators or whoever will plant false information and as it were, to tag on to algorithms and thereby spread and cause dissension and division. I'm aware of that, but we can't use these restrictions to allow legitimate, good faith opinions to go through. So it requires a balancing act.
Just to comment on coronavirus and lockdowns, I would say in hindsight, nearly everything government said has been proven to be false, and that a greater ability to challenge the narrative at the time might have reduced some of the costs and the losses that have arisen as a result. And so, as you say, it's in time of crisis, you need challenge to the narrative. And just in making public policy decisions, every government needs the red and the blue team who are competing with one another to say, is this the right policy? Are we doing something foolish just because we're in a crisis? Final question. How should Christians react to hate speech when it's promoted by governments or politicians in power?
So I understand that to mean if the actual, say, racist speech, if the government is taking, for instance, a racist position, that's what I understand the question to mean. I presume that means hate speech in the sense that I defined it as, for instance, okay, let's take an example, genuine. I'm not very familiar with the situation in Burma, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but perhaps I think there might be, for instance, instigation of, as it were, okay, let's take a historical example of Nazi Germany, just because it's the easiest. If you have a government that is mandating, as it were, anti-Semitic abuse, well, I think, as it were, the distinction is absolutely clear for Christians. There is no place for abuse. There is no place for racism of that kind. Now, obviously, we must distinguish that from how this ideology can often grow to mean, for instance, not being allowed to criticize other religions. That doesn't fall. So it calls for wisdom among Christians for sure. But if Christians find themselves in a situation where, for instance, a fascist racist power is genuinely in office, then I think our mission there is to have a counter speech to that. I think a speech of love, of genuine love, and that's the thing that most upsets me when Christians are tarnished with these labels of hatred. I mean, if you go to never mind a bustling church, any church in a place like Britain or whatever, it's full of people from all across the world, from all sorts of background. It's probably the least. I mean, speaking as a straight white male, whatever, but they're the least hateful places on earth, really. So I think in those situations, Christians should be examples, and there are plenty of examples from history where Christians did resist in that fashion during these times of totalitarianism.
We've plenty of value from you, Matthew. I think I'll close in prayer, because this is a deeply troubling issue, and many countries are struggling with this, and politicians need wisdom. So I'll close our time in prayer. Father God, we thank you for this time. Thank you for Matthew and his insights and understanding of the laws across many countries. We pray for just laws to be passed and implemented in this area that will wisely balance the need for freedom of speech and religion and expression and association with protections where speech can be harmful or deceptive or facilitating of theft. We know this is a very difficult question, and so we pray for wisdom. Particularly, we ask that you raise up godly, principled, honest politicians, particularly across Europe, and we would think carefully and wisely about balancing these considerations. We pray that your people, your church, would be protected from attempts to suppress religion and free expression with use of these laws. We pray particularly for Harvey Rasmussen in Finland, who's facing further challenge in the Supreme Court in Finland for upholding biblical truth. We pray that you would be with her and strengthening her. We ask all these things for your glory. Amen. So, Johannes, would you like to say a closing word?
Well, first of all, thank you for closing prayer. Thank you, Matthew, for all your comments and words. Just to clarify one thing, because it's also Sallux event that obviously, while we can have different opinions on the Holocaust, whether it should be, I mean, not on the Holocaust itself, we can have different opinions on whether denial of the Holocaust should be forbidden or not. We can all agree, and Matthew was clear on that it happened in the scale that historians agree that it happened, and that 6 million or more Jews and many others also were murdered systematically. Just to clarify that in order to avoid any misunderstanding there. Although Matthew was clear on his opinion there, and we agree on this. And also to say that some ECPM member parties want denial of the Holocaust being forbidden. So we can have a discussion on that. I mean, on whether or not to prohibit that speech, but be very sensitive on it. And because we can also see that sometimes people use this to abuse it, to use certain freedoms to abuse them. So it's indeed, as we said before, that it's always a very difficult balancing act, especially when it comes to these historical realities and truths. And by the way, in Turkey, it is practical forbidden to speak about the genocide against the Christian peoples of Turkey. So that is also a reality. But again, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Jubilee Centre, for all their contributions. Just to also underline, Paul, your opinion on Corona is also very much all right, but obviously it's not a Sallux opinion. So I thank everybody for joining, and I thank everybody for being part of the discussion, and I invite everybody to look at the Sallux webpage and to get to know both Sallux and Jubilee Centre. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.